Vernon Hall, Chapter 20. Love Conquers All. I put down Mother's journal. I began to feel a little dizzy. How long had I been reading it? How long had I been at Vernon Hall? I saw the rays of daylight penetrate through the vines. The soup bowl in front of me was dry. The chill in the atmosphere intensified. I glanced around the decaying main hall. This house is where all the drama occurred. The confrontation with Christopher Vernon, Mother's romantic meetings with him. I was sitting in a time capsule of sorts. I wondered whether Christopher Vernon had in fact drowned when he jumped off the cliffs, or whether he had survived. Mother's journal had filled my eyes with tears, reading about the difficulties both she and Father faced and the challenges Father confronted in winning Mother. It was also very inspirational and heartbreaking at the same time. I was alone. Mother, Father, and Arthur were all gone. I then remembered the grave in the garden outside and realized it was Amelia's. I would pray beside her grave, just as Mother had requested. However, as I rose, I suddenly felt a tremor and heard thunderous reverberation. Have the Nazis done it again? I thought to myself. But I then realized it was no bomb. The walls cracked, the ceiling began to collapse. There were thuds and bangs, and the dust from the shattering walls billowed like swirls of fog. Vernon Hall was falling apart. Mr. Kit! Mr. Kit! I screamed. I attempted to make a run for the main door, but in all the frenzy, I stumbled upon a table and fell. My leg was injured. I dragged myself across the floor and continued to shout for help. Mr. Kit, help me! Somebody help! I was unable to move. The raucous din became more intense. I saw something through the dust. It made no sense at all. The dust seemed to slither like a snake. And then suddenly, it took the form of a woman. No, it cannot be. Scarlet? I whispered, my heart pounding. It was her, however, just as Mother had described her in her journal, ravishing with fire in her eyes. I am here. I have always been here. I was here before you, and I will be here after you. This is what she had said to Mother, but Mother had been too frightened to confront her. Scarlet, I know what happened to you was wrong, but you must let go of the past. Look what it has done to you. You are not at peace because you're holding on to anger, and it has made you poisonous. You must leave Vernon Hall. This house does not belong to you, I shouted. The ghost of Scarlet continued to stare at me with fire in her eyes until that fire turned to smoke and her entire body disintegrated into swirling mists and disappeared. The grand chandelier that hung over me began to rock, and the ceiling shattered, crashing down where I lay. But just before the chandelier crashed to the ground, a powerful hand grabbed my arm and pulled me aside. It was Mr. Kit. He quickly lifted me in his arms and hurried outside with his large stride. We stood outside and watched Vernon Hall crumble before our eyes. I covered my mouth in shock. Centuries of evil, deceit, lies, and wickedness had come to an end. But of course, along with the evil, all those beautiful memories of Mother and Amelia were now nothing more than debris. Perhaps this house belonged to no one. It had brought misfortune into everybody's lives. It was damned. I wanted to tell Mr. Kit about Mother's journal and Scarlet's ghost, but remembering how Mother always thought people perceived her as being delusional, I decided to remain calm and practical. It had to collapse sooner or later, my dear, just as I had warned you. Today had to be that day. It is a coincidence, though, he giggled. A coincidence? I was baffled. Yes, my dear, there is delightful news. Winston Churchill has announced that the war is officially over. Why, revelers are jubilating all over the country, he grinned. I looked at Mr. Kit in bewilderment. The war is over? Mr. Kit, how long was I inside Vernon Hall? What day is it today? Mr. Kit widened his eyes and exclaimed, My dear, you've been in there for some 2 nights now. Why, today's the 8th of May, Victory in Europe Day. I was puzzled. This never-ending war was officially over. I was speechless. And what baffled me more was that I was in Vernon Hall for 2 nights, without food, without water. I could hardly make sense of the situation. I did check on you now and then, my dear, but each time I found you sound asleep. I assume you'll be taking the train back to London this afternoon? Mr. Kit inquired. I shall, Mr. Kit. I'll go to Mother's grave, but before that, I will pray beside the grave in that overgrown garden. I think I now know whose grave it is. I assumed Mr. Kit would be anxious to know the identity of the body in the grave, but the strange old man didn't ask. You'd best get on with it then, my dear, he smiled. Very well, Mr. Kit. Thank you so much for rescuing me. If you hadn't, I would have died, I said gratefully. Mr. Kit giggled and exclaimed, Ah, there is no need to thank me, my dear. I had to rescue you. Wonderful news is about to come your way. You'll see. I had no idea what Mr. Kit was referring to, but I assumed it was the jubilation of the end of the war. I felt sorry for Mr. Kit. As Vernon Hall was now nothing more than rubble, what would he do? I posed my question, and he scratched his silver scalp. Well, I'm not very sure, my dear. I feel my job is over now. I think I was just waiting for you. Now I shall go wherever the Lord takes me. He smiled again. I shook hands with him and turned toward the garden where Amelia was buried. The pain in my leg had subsided to some degree by this point. Mr. Kit spoke again. Oh, my dear, I forgot to give you something. What, Mr. Kit? Take this rose and put it on your mother's grave. He smiled sentimentally with misty eyes. It was an enchanting rose, and it brought a smile to my lips. So here's to hope, Mr. Kit, eh? I winked. Mr. Kit patted my arm and said something which left me dumbfounded. You resemble your mother, dear. Well, when you do visit her later today, do tell her that Christopher Vernon really did love her. I felt I was dreaming. I stared into Mr. Kit's eyes, and as I continued to peer deeper and deeper, I realized his eyes were hazel. It suddenly dawned on me that Kit was short for Christopher. I wanted to weep. I wanted to question him. I wanted to talk to him about the past. I was looking at the man Mother once loved. But before I approached him, a palpable mist swirled before my eyes and enshrouded Mr. Kit. It was a thick fog, and for a moment I was completely blinded by it. Mr. Kit! Christopher Vernon! I shouted. But it was too late. He was gone. I looked around the garden and elsewhere, but he was nowhere to be seen. I had seen the ghost of Scarlet with my own eyes. Was this Christopher Vernon's ghost? Or had that been him in flesh and blood? I was aghast. I wept. I wept because everyone had doubted him all these years. Mother had wondered whether Ezekiel had changed, whether he really did love her. She couldn't answer those questions, but I could now. I wiped my tears and went to Amelia's grave. I prayed beside her just as Mother had instructed. Goodbye, Amelia. If you are with Mother now, say hello to her for me. I smiled solemnly.